The Adventurous Chef, Alexis Soyer, by Anne Arnold. On October 14th of 1809, in the small French town of Meaux, famous for its cheese, Alexis Benoit Soyer was born. His mother and father kept a shop. Alexis was their third son. He was bright and curious. When he turned 9, he was sent to the cathedral school. His mother hoped he would become a priest. At school, Alexis loved music, but not the rules. He thought of a plan to escape. One midnight, he rang the great church bell. It was also the local fire alarm. The entire garrison turned out. People ran from their houses in fear. The whole town was in an uproar. Alexis was expelled from school, of course. It was his first thoroughly successful practical joke. He was 12 years old and in disgrace at home. His brother Philippe, who was a chef in Paris, wrote him, "Come be my apprentice. With your gifts, if you work hard, you could reach the top of our profession." By the time he was 17, Alexis was directing a staff of 12 cooks. He kept them in good spirits with his amusing ways. One day he told Philippe, "Now that I'm a chef, I will dress as I please." He called his style à la zoug zoug, the cloth being cut on the bias so that the stripes ran diagonally. He wore his hat at a raffish angle, loose and floppy. Even the shape of his calling card was unconventional. In 1831, Philippe went to England to seek his fortune. He had taste, training, experience, and a French accent. In short, all that was necessary to become head cook in an aristocratic English household. Soon he was chef to the Duke of Cambridge. He wrote to Alexis, "Come join me in the land where the French chef is king. You may choose your lord and name your price." Alexis sailed at once. At first he worked with his brother, creating elaborate menus for the Duke of Cambridge's frequent dinner parties. Then the Duke of Sutherland asked him to join his staff. Soyer went on to work for several other noblemen and gentlemen. His reputation spread. In 1837, he was offered the position of chef de cuisine at the newly renovated Reform Club in England. Soyer accepted on the condition that he and the architect would design the kitchen together. When they met, Soyer explained his conception. "Let us create a kitchen of spotless efficiency. No detail shall be left to chance. The fish shall be kept on an iced marble slab to retain its freshness. Fruits and vegetables shall be stored in labeled bins. Dinner plates shall be kept warm and ready for serving in chambers beside the gas stoves." "Gas stoves?" the architect exclaimed. "But of course," Soyer replied. "I insist upon this new gas. It produces a flame that is easier to control and cleaner than wood or coal, with far less labor." "These are excellent ideas," the architect agreed. "Your enthusiasm and invention shall be allowed full scope." In the time, the Reform Club kitchens became one of the famous sights of London. Take a moment to review the kitchens of the Reform Club. The meals that emerged from the Reform Club kitchen were memorable, but Soyer was not just content to cook. His restless mind was always seeking improvements, and his desk at the Reform Club was cluttered with drawings and models of his various inventions. Now that he was established as a chef of the Reform Club, Soyer felt that he could afford to marry. He decided to send his portrait to a woman he knew in Paris, along with a proposal of marriage. But first he had to find a portrait painter. His secretary, Monsieur Volant, knew an artist and took Soyer to his house. Monsieur Simoneau welcomed his old friend Volant. When he learned the purpose of this visit, however, the artist suggested that Sawyer would be better served by his stepdaughter. Miss Emma Jones, he claimed, excelled him in the art of portraiture. Matters were quickly arranged with Miss Jones, who was free to begin the very next day. Au revoir, mademoiselle, Alexis said, kissing Miss Jones's hand, as was his custom. Until tomorrow. Au revoir, until tomorrow, Emma answered, smiling quietly at Monsieur Sawyer. On the way home, Sawyer confided to Volant. I'm afraid having my portrait painted has become a pretext. Volant stopped and looked at Alexis. What do you mean? Now that I am in love with Miss Emma, there is no need to send my portrait to Paris, Sawyer answered. They both laughed and danced through the park, arm in arm. Emma Jones and Alexis Soyer were married in London on April 12, 1837. Emma painted, Alexis cooked, and they delighted in each other's company. More and more people heard about the clever chef-inventor. One day, the German Duke of Saxe-Coburg visited the Reform Club. Sawyer showed him around the kitchen and put his inventions through their paces. Then Sawyer led the Duke into his private room where Emma's paintings now covered the walls. The Duke was enchanted with all that he saw and invited Sawyer to return with him to Brussels. He should bring some of Emma's paintings and his own kitchen devices to show the Duke's brother, the King of the Belgians. But Sawyer did not want to leave Emma, who would be having their first baby in a few weeks. That evening, Alexis and Emma discussed the day's events. He mentioned the Duke's invitation. It is impossible, of course, Sawyer declared. I wish to be here with you. But you would return in time, Alexis. You must go. It is a great honor, and you have been working so hard. This holiday is just what you need. I would enjoy showing your paintings to the king, Sawyer conceded. And your wonderful inventions, Alexis. How they would admire them in Brussels. You simply must go. So it was decided. On August 27, 1842, Sawyer left London with the Duke of Saxe-Coburg. He would come home in time for their baby's arrival. But it was not to be. 2 days later, a violent thunderstorm broke over London, terrifying Emma. The windows rattled at each thunderclap. Lightning cracked the sky. In her fright, Emma gave birth prematurely, and both she and the baby died. Monsieur Volant traveled to Brussels to break the terrible news and bring Alexis back to London. Sawyer could not forgive himself for having left his wife's side. I will never marry again, he insisted as he sat with Volant in his private quarters at the Reform Club, surrounded by Emma's paintings. I could never find a woman like Emma. She shone as a painter, as a musician, as a housewife, and had 100 other amiable qualities. What a treasure she was! Only cooking keeps me from complete despair. And so he worked more intently than ever. Each day Sawyer prepared elaborate meals at the Reform Club for the influential and the rich, and every evening as he returned home he saw the poor and hungry begging for food on the streets of London. I will cook for these people as well, Sawyer decided. He began teaching charitable ladies to make nutritious soup to feed the hungry poor. Florence Nightingale's aunt was one of his first pupils. But Sawyer wanted to do more. With the aid of the vicar of a local parish church, he opened a small soup kitchen where he could feed 200 or 300 people each day. He worked on designs for a soup boiler and a kitchen that could serve thousands. Yet still the ranks of the hungry grew. In 1845, a blight destroyed the potato crop in Ireland. Most people in Ireland lived almost entirely on potatoes, and more than 1 million people died of starvation. The British government asked Sawyer to build one of his soup kitchens in Dublin. Nothing like it had been organized on such a scale before. 9,000 meals a day can be made in this kitchen alone, Sawyer explained. And with the help of carts and barrows with fire beneath them, my hot soup can be taken all over town. To help the poor feed themselves, he compiled a shilling cookery for the people. He also published The Gastronomic Regenerator, a recipe book for the wealthy, or rather for their cooks. And for the people in between, he wrote The Modern Housewife. I will help everyone to eat well, he would say. While Sawyer was feeding the rich and the poor in England, no one was properly nourishing the British soldiers far off in the Crimea, where France, Turkey, and Britain were at war with Russia. In 1855, after a year of combat, one miserable soldier wrote to Sawyer, "This food is so badly cooked here that we cannot eat it." Sawyer said to himself, "I will send recipes, yes, and if I can do things my way, I will go there myself." 4 months before, the Times had reported on the appalling conditions in the Crimean hospitals, where soldiers were dying from the septic wounds, contaminated water, frostbite, and neglect. In response, the British government had sent Florence Nightingale and her nurses to the Turkish city of Scutari. With starvation added to the soldiers' miseries, the government agreed to Sawyer's proposal. Within the week, Sawyer sailed for Turkey with the first of his large portable camp stoves, 4 cooks, and the authority to act as he thought best. Stoves for all the troops were ordered to follow as quickly as possible. When he arrived in Scutari, an aide-de-camp led him through the filthy streets to the hospital. There he was greeted by Florence Nightingale and her fellow nurses. He found the hospital kitchens noisy, dirty, smoky, and chaotic. The smell of charred food lingered in the air. People were delighted by the arrival of the flamboyant chef. Everyone was eager to learn from him. Sawyer called in bricklayers to rebuild the smoky chimneys. He had giant copper cauldrons retinned so the food would no longer be tainted by verdigris. He also told the purveyors, "This wet coal dust will never do as fuel, and these ancient chickens." Soon the charcoal improved, and the old fowls grew amazingly younger. He posted his recipes on the kitchen walls. Now everyone was following the same plan. Using ingredients at hand without added expense, he taught the soldiers how to cook. Miss Nightingale had brought nurses, cleanliness, and order to the hospital in Scutari. Under Sawyer's leadership, the hospital kitchens began producing excellent meals for the sick and wounded. Now the two could sail together for the battlefields of the Crimea. When they arrived, there was no suitable dwelling for them in Balaclava, so they slept aboard whatever ship happened to be at anchor. Every day Sawyer mounted his pony and visited the regiments. He handed out recipes and instructed the men in the most efficient and delicious way to use their rations. When equipment was lacking, he cajoled the suppliers into providing it. His cheerful, comical ways encouraged the troops. Miss Nightingale, alas, soon caught Crimean fever and lay in bed very ill. Sawyer waited for news from the sanatorium where she was confined. When Miss Nightingale could eat again, she brought delicacies to her hospital bed every day. The hard work, the mud, and the diseases of the battlefield left Sawyer in a weakened condition. He too fell ill from Crimean fever and was sent to the hospital in Scutari. There the doctor warned him, "If you go back to Crimea, take your tombstone with you. I strongly advise you to return to England immediately." But Sawyer replied that his work was not done. "I cannot leave until my stoves arrive, and I have taught the soldiers how to use them." He spent 3 months in bed, his case considered hopeless. But the care of a young surgeon, Vincent Ambler, brought him to his feet. And now that he could cook for himself, his strength soon returned. When Sawyer learned that his stoves had arrived at the battlefront, he gathered his cooks together and sailed once again for Balaclava. Before Sawyer arrived, food was boiled in a large pot set on a tripod over an open fire. Most of the heat vanished into the air. Soon there were no trees left near the battlefields. Firewood had to be shipped to Balaclava, then carried in heavy carts drawn by horses through muddy roads to the temporary outdoor kitchens. The expense was enormous. Sawyer's efficient stove, with its enclosed firebox, used a tenth of the amount of fuel. A soldier could make a stack of pots inside the stove so that the meat, potatoes, and vegetables, and a pudding could all be steamed at the same time. Sawyer's stove was so successful that it was adopted by the entire army to be used at home and abroad in times of war and peace. After 3 years of bitter fighting, peace came to the Crimea in 1856. Everyone wanted to celebrate with feasts, and Sawyer was as busy and sociable as ever. He decided to give a farewell dinner for his 50 favorite friends, but everything seemed to go wrong. The plates and cutlery had gone astray. 2 of its cooks were ill. The singing club felt it could not perform without its 2 leading tenors, who had already left with their regiments. Even the turf that Sawyer had laid out in front of his makeshift villaret had withered into brown wisps in the hot sun. "Paint it green," Sawyer commanded his helpers. From then on, everything improved. The utensils were found and the plates returned. 2 volunteer cooks appeared. The singing club came in spite of its missing members, and an army engineer provided a beautiful chandelier. By candlelight, the painted grass looked perfectly natural. Of course, the food was superb. As the few remaining guests mounted their horses at 5 the next morning, Sawyer knew his last party had been the best of all. It was time to go home. Sawyer packed his bags, his pots, and his pans, and made his way to the ship. In port, he met a Russian orphan who pleaded with Sawyer to take him to England. "I will be your servant," the boy vowed. "You shall keep me company on the way home," Sawyer replied. By the time they reached England, Daniel Maximovich Chamichenga was a devoted attendant, dressed in a uniform of Sawyer's design. During the voyage, Sawyer taught the boy English and the ways of the kitchen. The chef also wrote a lively account of his Crimean adventures. He called it a culinary campaign. Florence Nightingale never fully recovered from Crimean fever. On a return to England, she took to her bed and rarely left it. From that bed, however, she reformed the British Army's barracks and hospitals throughout Britain and India. Her report for the Royal Commission on the Health of the British Army was blunt. "Our soldiers enlist to death in the barracks," she wrote. She appealed to Sawyer. "The Army will use your stoves, of course, but what are stoves without chefs? You must organize schools of regimental and hospital cookery, plan their kitchens, and devise recipes. There is so much to be done." "I will begin at once, mademoiselle." He wrote cookbooks, invented and tested an improved canning process for meat, and laid out a new model kitchen for the Wellington barracks. Although Crimean fever had also shattered Sawyer's health, he refused to reduce his activities. One day in the summer of 1857, he was invited to a picnic outside London. When the groom came with the horse, he warned Sawyer, "Your stallion seems quite frisky this morning. Wouldn't you rather take the train? I, who have traveled all over the Crimea on ponies and chargers and mules." Indignantly, Sawyer mounted and trotted off at a brisk clip, a little too fast for the skittish horse, who was soon out of control. He tossed his rider to the ground, but Sawyer's foot was caught in the stirrup, and he was dragged for many yards by one leg. When his foot slipped free, Sawyer was astonished to find he could stand up. He said to a member of the crowd watching, "Would you please call me a cab? I am late for a picnic. My friends will be worried." When Sawyer appeared, he explained to the guests, "Forgive my disarray. I am a bit tattered and bruised, but you see I was dragged quite a way by my horse. Nothing serious, however. It reminded me of the Crimea. Tell us, Sawyer." As Sawyer left the picnic, he announced to his friends, "You'll probably find me in bed for the next few days. Do come by for a visit." The doctors came as well. Sawyer explained to Vaillant, "I do not put much faith in physicians, but I would not dream of hurting their feelings. I always hide Dr. A's medicine before Dr. B arrives. Just put this bottle in the cupboard for me, please." In a few weeks, Sawyer felt better and was again as busy as ever. Dr. Ambler begged him to rest, but Sawyer insisted upon opening his new kitchen at the Wellington barracks. It would set an example for other military establishments. On opening day, a crowd of military officers gathered in the kitchen to watch Sawyer turn basic army rations into delicious dinner for 300 men. Sawyer, ever playful, waved his hand toward his well-worn pots and pans. Gentlemen, you have your battery of weapons. This is my Crimean battery, de cuisine. And now for a dinner. Instead of twice-boiled beef and watery broth, we will have green pea soup, salt pork and cabbage, roast mutton, beef dumplings, crisp potatoes, and rice pudding. This is splendid, Sawyer, exclaimed the admiring Lord Rokeby, a fellow veteran of the Crimea. You must repeat this on a larger scale. I would like to see you feed a whole battalion of the Guards. But shortly after the feast for 300, Sawyer fell ill again. The doctors came to see him as before, one after another. When Sawyer felt just a little better, he would summon a few friends. Do come, I will cook. Then we'll go to the theater. After that, on to Frost's for a bite to eat. He would arrive home at dawn, tumble into bed, and remain there for days. He recovered eventually, but each time he was weaker. Surely my cooking will make me well, he liked to think. It has never failed me yet. Again, he planned a dinner party, drew up the menu, invited guests, and ordered dessert from town. But this last meal was never cooked. Alexis Soyer died in his bed on August 5th, 1858.